We're in the home of Charlotte and Julius Goos in Augusta, Maine. And we'll start out, I would like if you could each, in turn, tell a little bit of your family's history, where your family came from, and where in Maine they went to, and some of these, any early memories you have of grandparents and so on are of interest to me. But I can ask you as you go along. I'm happy to hold this.
Oh, this is Charlotte, and I was born in the Boston area. My grandparents came over from Russia. My grandmother was 14 years old. I'm not quite sure how old my grandfather was, but he wasn't too old. And he worked in the Boston, probably Chelsea. I think he was a tailor, or else he pressed clothes, whatever. And my grandmother had a sister and brother that lived in Skowhegan, Maine. The brother discouraged her from moving with her family from the ghetto of Boston to Skowhegan, but the sister kept asking her to come because she was not too well and she thought she would live a better life. She'd have a house there and not in a tenement in Boston. So in the Boston area, they probably lived in Dorchester or Roxbury or Chelsea, whatever. And so my grandmother did go to Skowhegan. Now, her brother had said, "Don't come, Esther, because you're going to starve." And they literally were so poor. So my grandfather tried peddling, which his brother-in-law did, and it didn't work out for a living. She moved with 6 children. And so in order to have food on the table, he used to commute to Boston and work during the week and come back weekends. And something like a trucking company would give him a ride down and give him a ride back. Unfortunately, on one of his trips back from Boston, the truck was in an accident and he was seriously injured, I should say, and later died in the hospital. So my grandmother was left with 7 children because they had had a child in Skowhegan in her care without a husband. But already her boys had some age to them and were able to work and help sustain the family. They went to school and they worked after school, worked summers, and they went in the junk business, which was part of they through the years, they worked themselves up. I came to live with I was 5 years old when my grandfather died, and I lived in Boston with my mother and father, and unfortunately, I think it was the times, but they had 2 children within 15 months, and there was a depression. And so somehow, because of all the strife, there was a divorce, and my mother was a single parent trying to work and bring up 2 children. And so my grandmother said to her, "If I could help out and you want to leave the children with me for a while, I'll take care of them so you could get on your feet." Well, I never left. I moved to Skowhegan and I stayed. My sister went back for a year. My sister's 15 months younger. And my mother found it too difficult without me there to take care of her and brought her back. And so I went through school from the 3rd grade through high school in Skowhegan. In the meantime, the Lipman family, that was my mother's maiden name, went into the hauling poultry to the market. They used to go to the farms and buy poultry, and through this started expanding the poultry industry, and they were what they call the kings of the poultry industry in the state of Maine. And they used to raise poultry on farms and take the live product to Boston or to other markets ship it. And they decided that they would build a processing plant where they would process and have the product ready to sell to the stores, to the wholesaler that sold to the stores. And so they moved from Skowhegan to Bangor, Maine. And they had a processing plant there. As the years went on, their business grew, and they moved to Augusta because they needed more space and expansion, which they weren't able to do in Bangor. And they, what would you call the type of business they had?
Integrated.
They ended up with an integrated product from the farm from the chicken to the finished product. They
owned the whole process.
Yes, yeah, everything from having a rendering plan from the offal from the chicken. And Purdue, in fact, came to Maine to find out how Lippmann was going through their various phases of processing chicken and feeding chicken. They had a grain mill. They had a hatchery. They had a
parts of the state.
Yes, and the farms were all over in central Maine. And one of the reasons that they moved to Augusta from Bangor was because the farms that they had located, they were contract farmers. In other words, farmers would buy all the feed, the fuel. Lippmann would buy this, and then they would pay them. They were on a contract for raising the poultry, but the Lippmanns also have farms of their own that they raised the product.
Where they raise, I see. Instead of contracting the raising to other families, in this case, they just.
But they did both. They did both.
Did that themselves
They bought farms, and they had people that worked for them on the farms. And as I say, they moved to Augusta because it was centrally located to their farms, which meant that the trucks that they owned to pick up the poultry didn't have to go long distances. But so how did I come from Bangor to Augusta? I went from Skowhegan to Bangor with my grandmother. And from Bangor to Augusta because I ran the office. And at that time, I'd gone through business college, and I took over the control. I was the controller of the Lippmann Poultry Company. In the meantime, in Bangor, I met my husband-to-be. His sister and I were very close friends, and he came back from the service, and we got married. At that time, I'll let you tell the story about my unemployed husband. But I gave up my job, and I married Julius Goos, and we came. Do you want to?
You're doing fine.
Well, I'm gonna before we switch over, I want to just backtrack a little bit and
ask
about a couple things. One is, what did you hear, if you heard anything, about where they had come from in Russia? Did you ever hear stories about that?
You know, my grandmother never really talked about Russia. I mean, she talked about coming over, and when she was here, and she didn't even talk about how she met her husband, but I'm sure it's because they lived in the same area. And she and a sister married two brothers. So this is how her sister was younger than my grandmother, but that's probably how she met her husband. Interesting, my grandmother kept kosher in Skowhegan. Now, to keep kosher in Skowhegan, Maine, is quite a chore. they had to go to Waterville. There was a shechet in Waterville to get their meat. And they went by horse and buggy to Waterville to get their meat. Chickens they brought to the shechet. He also was a Hebrew school teacher as well as the shechet. And they brought chickens there, and then they had their own egg. And, of course, there were many times that they were without meat, but there was always baked beans. And somehow my grandmother had a golden touch, I swear, that she could make a feast from nothing. But I remember chicken. She would make chicken soup, and it would be chicken soup served for 2 days. Well, of course, she canned tomatoes. And so
she grew tomatoes in her garden or something.
Right, she had a beautiful garden. She had a green touch, and so she canned tomatoes. So the chicken soup became tomato soup, and then she had all these vegetables that she had canned, so it became a tomato vegetable soup. So you had a feast all week on this chicken soup, which was made from a hen, of course, and. There were, probably before my time, I'm sure it was hard to put food on the table, but there always seemed to be plenty of food when I was there. Yeah. But I'm sorry, I can't tell you much about Russia because I don't know, and unfortunately, the people that would know are gone.
I have the sense also from meeting many people. And my own grandparents, who were also from Russia, that this, in very many cases, people didn't really want to talk about that very much. I think they had come here to start a new life.
Right. This was where they were going to make it.
Right.
And in Russia, they couldn't make it. I mean, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. The men came because of having to go in the service. It eliminated by coming over here. But, of course, things were different in that time, too. You had to be sponsored by someone. You just couldn't come and live on welfare here. Mm-hmm. You had to have someone that was going to take care of you until you took care of yourself.
Almost ready to get your story.
There won't be much left
Bangor
to tell.
Story, but I wanted to hear also, you mentioned at some point that somebody was in the peddling business before settling into the poultry peddling. What do you remember hearing about that peddling life?
Well, they had a junk business even when they went in the poultry business. What happened was one of the Lipman boys, in order to make a living, trucked poultry to Boston. He'd go and he'd buy it on the farm and he'd truck it to Boston. Well, my grandmother's brother was in this business, and I guess he had worked for him, and he became an entrepreneur, went on his own. And he ended up marrying his wife was from Massachusetts, and so he settled in there. So his brothers just continued the business. They had the truck, and they had the know-how, and so they just continued. And it just, as I say, they were entrepreneurs. They really just made it grow. But the junk business was really what gave them the living in order to start the poultry business.
And the junk business would involve just traveling around different towns. And
well,
buying.
people brought it was scrap metal, it was paper products, it was wiping rags. They used to sell the mills wiping rags. There again, it was many products, and they were big in that particular industry, but the other industry had more growth to it.
Mm-hmm. All right. So now, if we could hear your
now the other side of the story, huh? Well, listen, my father came over to this country from Poland. He had been married in Poland, but his family remained there. he came over by himself. He left Poland and landed in Boston and started to work there, I think, picking rags, sorting out rags. And he tried that for a while, and then the story goes, while he was working, he heard this cow mooing, and he had been in the cattle business in Poland.
Oh.
So he says, what am I doing here? And he says, this is time for a change, apparently. So he took off. He went to Bangor, where my mother had an uncle. And he started dealing in cattle. He bought he had a horse and wagon, and he used to buy, and because he couldn't write, but he learned to sign his name, and he used to go out and deal with farmers, and he would sign the checks, and the farmer that he bought the cow from would fill in the rest. Thank goodness the farmers were very honest, the majority. So he kept doing that until eventually he purchased a truck. He got himself a driver, and he continued. And he continued doing that, and then he brought over the rest of the family from Europe. And, of course, he had to make good for them when you bring people over. And not only did he bring his wife and a brother of mine over, he brought his sister and her family, and there was quite a few of them.
2 sisters.
There might have been, there was, I don't know how many. Well, anyways, he brought them over, and
His mother.
and his mother as well. And you asked Charlotte about what was the stories that I remember from that they talked about in Europe. Well, one of the stories I remember was that my mother was trying to escape from these Bolsheviks that were overrunning the particular town. So she had hid in the barn or under under hay. So these Bolsheviks came in, and they used pitchforks, and they picked through the hay, and she had a scab where it hit her head. And then that was one of the stories that I remember from in Poland. And also some story where they were running away, and she told her son to jump or something, and they rescued him. It was all quite vague. Well, anyways, we grew up in Bangor. My father bought a home, of course, and then he not only had brought his family, he brought some of my mother's relations over and settled them in Canada because he couldn't get them into the United States. So that was my European background. That was because I was born in Bangor. I'm an original maniac. And because I went to the local schools, graduated high school, went to the University of Maine, got a degree in mechanical engineering, and I worked for Carbide and Carbon Chemical Corporation. And when I got out of school, before I was drafted, they had assigned me to go to Oak Ridge, Tennessee.
You worked on the Manhattan
and I was connected with the Manhattan District. You're familiar with that project.
The Manhattan Project?
Right.
Uh-huh.
So anyways, before I was sent there, I was drafted. I wasn't able to get a deferment. So after I was drafted, they found out something about my background, so they reassigned me to what they call a special engineer detachment. I did my basic training and everything else, and then I was shipped to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, with his special engineer detachment. And there I joined others who are engineers, you name it. But we were in the military service, of course. And I worked there until I got out in 46, I believe. And
you got out of the service, Julius.
yeah, and then I remained down there working as a civilian.
At that lab there.
Pardon?
At the lab there.
Oh yeah, on the project in what they call the K-25 area. And from there, I decided I didn't particularly want to end up being in Tennessee, so I quit my job there and came home to Maine. And at that time, I married Charlotte. And I started distributing dressed poultry on my own. The poultry, of course, Charlotte told you, was processed by her uncles, and I distributed just within the state of Maine. And we managed to put 3 kids through college.
3 children.
After tax-free dollars. And let's see. Oh, and then after I gave up the poultry distributing business, I went to work. I got a brokerage agreement with Swift, which was one of my customers. And there I remained until I took early retirement at the age of 63. And Charlotte was started to go into the antique business, and so I helped her do that until here I am.
So could I ask, since you're speaking now anyway, a little bit about the Jewish community in Bangor, where you grew up? I'd love to hear what that was like, and
Tell them about the synagogue you
Well,
belong to.
listen, we had
Julius,
there were 3 synagogues in the area: the Orthodox and the Orthodox and the
Orthodox.
not so Orthodox. They were within a stone's throw of each other, almost within the same street and corner.
On York Street.
On York Street and the corner of York and Essex. Corner of York and Essex was what they call the Tolos Yitzchak, which was an Orthodox synagogue, which my folks belonged to. And then across the street was the Beth Abraham Synagogue, which was also an Orthodox synagogue. And then what they call the Big Shoal was the Beth Israel, was the not so Orthodox synagogue. Well,
why? The obvious question is why were there 3 different synagogues?
Well, that's a good question.
Story behind that.
Yes.
Well, you can we can move freely back and forth.
Well, Charlotte
Yeah, maybe you
could
should
probably
sit
tell
here.
you more
Yeah.
about that.
When we moved to Bangor, we belonged to the conservative. But actually the conservative still had Orthodox rabbis. The synagogue that my in-laws belonged to, which through the years was no longer, was some of the people just didn't get along with the other people. It was small. It was a small congregation. And I think because of an argument or something, that some people belonged to one and some to the other. Your father would go to any. I had the sweetest father in the world. He would never fight with anyone. But I think the interesting thing is the rabbi from ZC's folks, or your synagogue to ZC, lived, the house that my father-in-law bought was, his part of the house was bigger than my house, but it had how many apartments in it besides? Three others, or four?
It was 1, 2,
Was-
3, 4. There was 4 apartments besides my
All right,
folks.
yeah. So there was 4 apartments, and in one apartment, the rabbi of that synagogue lived. And didn't they have a?
Sukkah,
They had a sukkah.
built-in sukkah.
All year round.
Yeah, all you had to
Yeah.
do was raise the roof. It was
Uh-huh.
on a pulley.
Yeah.
You just raised it up. It was a sukkah.
Uh-huh.
It had slats, so it would be open to the outside.
But
And
my-
no, it was great. It was sort of a fun for the kids because we used to go upstairs to eat our meals in the sukkah. It was like a picnic.
My father-in-law went to synagogue twice a day, before he went to work and after before. And ZC, you'll have to tell him the story of how you felt on Friday night when you went to services coming home. But you used to say that it used to make you feel so good because you knew you were going home to a wonderful meal that your mother had made. But my father, you could have offered my father-in-law $1 million. He would not do any business on Friday night or on Shabbos. Correct?
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of. I married into not only a religious family, but they lived their religion. It wasn't just word say, as you might say.
Now the Jews in Bangor were, in your family there was the cattle dealing. What other sorts of occupations did Jewish people?
It's interesting you mentioned that there were several Jewish cattle dealers. Actually, in proportion, there were probably more cattle dealers than for the amount of Jews that were there. Apparently, that was a fairly easy profession for them to take up, and a lot of them had come from farming areas in Europe, and so it sort of was natural.
But then there were merchants. See, I lived in Bangor too. There were a lot of merchants. How did they start? Maybe they started the same way my grandfather tried to, by peddling, and then they would get a storefront. You also had some people. Some of the Jewish people from Bangor were better educated. They were wealthier to begin with. They were doctors. They were dentists. Even in your father's generation, am I right? Right. You had an influx of German Jews, but most of the German Jews that came to Bangor were not the wealthy German Jews. Did you have wealthy German Jews that came to Bangor?
No,
See,
I don't think so. No, most of the German that came there were people that escaped, actually, from Germany. They were refugees that we
But they
know,
were
like the
middle-class.
nations
Yes.
and
Well, Augusta had German Jews that came here that were professional because we have a VA hospital. And they came, Freelander, there were a lot of German Jews that came here and worked at the hospitals. They were psychiatrists, they were medical doctors, while Bangor didn't get.
Oh, go ahead.
Julius, when his mother died and he was disposing of things, his father had a electric fence charger. And why he ever took it, I think it was a memory or something. Well, we're trying to clean out the garage. I mean, we've been here for over 50 years. And I see this contraption, and I said, what is it? He says, it's a fence charger. I said, what are you going to do with a fence charger? He says, I guess I should get rid of it. That's what that phone call is. He put an ad in the paper. He's getting rid of the fence charger. But we've been talking basically about us, not really about the other Jews in Maine. I think our backgrounds are probably what a lot of Jews in Maine came from, and they came to Maine because rather than work in the factories in Boston, they felt they could make a living here. And as Julius said, a lot of them came from farm country, so they didn't want to go to New York City. They weren't accustomed to city living. They were more rural people. But it's interesting. One thing that was very interesting to me, my grandmother came to Skowhegan, Maine. There were probably 8 Jewish families total. And 2 of them, one was her brother and one was her sister and family. And our street was basically French Catholic that we lived on. And they loved her. Now she always talked in a broken English because she had spoke Yiddish. And when she moved, they cried. But she had that wonderful relationship with them, and she was a people's person. And there was no doubt about it. Her children ran into anti-Semitism in schools, but they came above it. Or got through it, whatever. When I went to school, there may have been a few people, but basically I didn't feel, maybe I ignored it, but I didn't feel it. I do know that one of my teachers who liked me wanted me to get the DAR medal. And she submitted my name. I mean, I was, one of the class officers, and I did well in school, and she was fond of me. I did not get the DAR medal, and she came to me afterwards, and she said, she said, isn't it too bad because somebody isn't a certain religion, they can't receive this medal? But she was a transplant to Skowhegan. She was not one of, yes, she was not one of the, and the teacher that would not let me get the medal happened to be one of my favorite teachers because she was the algebra geometry teacher, which math was my subject. But that's the way that life was, and there are still certain societies that if you're Jewish, you don't belong to.
Still today in Maine.
Still today worldwide, not just in Maine. Yeah.
Yes.
I was talking about it.
You're mostly interested in how the Jews in the rural Maine.
How they lived,
how they made a living,
being Jewish, and how they adjusted and lived well with their rural neighbors. So Charlotte was just telling me
I don't think it was much different, other than if they were fairly religious, they had a little tougher job to keep their religion because of the numbers. There were very few.
Bangor didn't have the problem.
Well, Bangor was a large community. Well, figure they had kosher butchers, and there was no problem at that time. Now it's a problem in Bangor because they don't have a kosher butcher, but they can get frozen chicken and I don't know about meats.
They get meats out of Boston.
Oh.
They ship it up.
I don't think they've all become vegetarians. That's for sure. I don't think it was that much different, except that the environment might be different up in this part of the world, of the country.
I think one thing, Julius, that probably is very important to you, we've lost, but this is Maine as a whole, but we've lost a lot of the Jewish youth. Perhaps if the father had a law firm, but even the Rudmans, their children have gone away. We have 3 children. They preferred not going to the University of Maine because they had gone to school all their lives with these people that were going there, and they wanted to have a little wider scope. And one of them started at Colby, and he graduated Hampshire College in Amherst. My daughter, that's my oldest son. My daughter graduated UVM, and my youngest son graduated Tufts and Yale. My 2 boys married New York City Jewish girls, and my daughter married a corporate lawyer, Jewish corporate lawyer from Boston. And so we ended up not having any children that came back to Maine to live. They come to Maine to visit. And which we would have loved to have had. And they would have done well. Our oldest son's a lawyer in New York City, and he was popular. He would have done well in Augusta, but he married a New York City girl, and it would be hard to lovely woman, but it would be hard to transplant her. And our daughter had no choice because she married somebody that was a partner in a firm. And our youngest son, he's a dermatologist in Concord, Mass., and he wouldn't settle in New Haven. He wouldn't settle in New York, and his wife didn't want to come to Maine, so they ended up. He loved the area. In going to Tufts, he became familiar with that area, so they settled in the greater Boston area.
Are there any questions you can think of to ask us?
I'm wondering.
We might have missed something. What your interest?
It's unusual for families to have their children go away, which has diminished the Jewish population here in the state. Now, Portland is a very active Jewish community. Bangor has lost a lot of Jews.
Do you have a sense of obviously not these children coming back, but are there? You go to a synagogue here. Are there younger Jewish families moving in?
Well, let me tell you what happened. Ever hear of the hippies? All right. There were a group of them that came to Maine. Many of them were Jewish. And they're coming back to religion. We had, our rabbi has brought them in from the woods. And we actually, when we came here, because when the Lippmans moved here, it brought 10 families into this community. So how many were there in
Very few.
Very few. So all of a sudden, they used to have their services in a room downtown. The Jewish merchant allowed them to, it was above his store, and that's where they had the room. My uncle, oldest son, was bar mitzvah there. And my Uncle Frank says it's time for us to have our own building. And they had the Lippmans had a lot of connections. And and I have to tell you, the Jews of the state of Maine were generous. Everybody gave something, whether it was an I-beam or lumber or light fixtures, and people bought the Eternal Light, and am I right? And this building was built, and there was not 1 cent owed on it. We have now about 50 families. We have a 3/4 time. She's a Reform rabbi, Harvard grad that went on to rabbinical training. And
is she from Maine originally?
She's from Massachusetts.
Uh-huh.
She's a graduate of Harvard.
I said that. And she fulfills a need. We used to have a visiting rabbi. It started out that we had students that came for Yontif, and through the years, Julius and I got to...
No, the interesting part about Jewish life, even though we didn't have a rabbi, we always managed to bring in a student from New York for the high holidays, but we always maintained a Hebrew school somehow. We had someone to teach the kids.
Rabbis from other communities.
Rabbis from other communities. Somehow we managed to keep that. And, of course, that was the most important part, which today is probably number one, regardless of where you are, whether it's here in Augusta or up in Presque Isle.
And did your children go through? The children
went to school here. Yeah, and they all became bar mitzvah and bas mitzvah.
And did the whole Shabbos service, Julius.
Okay, well,
different. I'm bragging, but for a community like this, for a child to do the Shabbos service was something. And, of course, Camp Lown helped, too. Camp Lown helped our children, too. But our 2 boys were bar mitzvahed. Our daughter was bat mitzvahed. And in fact, she went through another bat mitzvah at the temple she belongs to in Boston, outside of Boston, as an adult. And... we always had layman services. Yeah, at least once a month you used to have a Friday night service.
We tried.
There were a number. My husband.
Other than the high holidays, we had no professionals. Yeah, so we used to have layman services. As good as we could, just to keep it alive.
They did a good job. Don't let him kid you. He's being modest.
We had different organizations. We had the B'nai B'rith, was more active then than it is now.
There's no B'nai B'rith now.
And we had a Hadassah.
No Hadassah here now.
None here now. So
now,
whether we've made progress or not, I don't know.
We did have Rabbi Aaron. Rabbi Aaron came.
One of the visiting rabbis.
He very brilliant. He would not get involved with life cycles, but he was extremely learned. And we had a lot of intermarriage. We have a lot of intermarriage in our community, but the intermarried couples were sending their children to Cheder. They had not converted, but they felt as though this is a basic of all religion, and so they were sending them. We were a conservative temple because, due to the fact that didn't have to be a mother to be Jewish. If you were Reform, if you educated your child in Judaism, then they could be considered Jewish if one of the parents were Jewish. So there was a vote taken, and they voted to join the Reform movement. And that basically, but when Rabbi Aaron came, and these non-Jewish wives and husbands respected him, so we had about 6 people that converted to Judaism. They had been part of our temple for a number of years, but could not see their way to convert. So he did a great job. Now, our first Rabbi Aaron came once a month. Emily Lipoff. Are you familiar with Emily? Emily Lipoff was a...
No, I live in western Massachusetts. Oh.
Emily Lipoff was our first monthly rabbi. And she now has the largest
Reformed
temple in the Boston
area.
She's the head rabbi there. So we've had some real...
She had come through here first.
This was their first pulpit.
First position.
Yeah. And but we've been fortunate because we've had some dynamic people here. And the visiting rabbis were dynamic. And Zizi and I were very fortunate because Yontef, I would always have them to dinner. And my children would sit around the table and ask questions, and because of it, it made our Yontif so wonderful.
I wonder if we could go back a little bit, because I think I want to hear still a little bit more about the cattle business. I'm interested to know, for just while you were on the telephone, Charlotte was telling me about how your family had, or your dad had, pasturage of his own, where he.
Yes.
So how did that work exactly? He just would buy a.
Well, he would go. He would go around to the different farmers, pick up and buy cattle, and because you had to have a place to put them. If they were milking cattle, you had to have a barn or something to put them into, especially during the cold weather. But he had a pasture. He bought a pasture in the Bangor area, and that's where he used to keep a lot of his cattle. And then he had another pasture outside of Bangor, where he would keep a lot of his younger cattle.